A New Mexico teenager is going to prison for shooting at a house party that he'd just been kicked out of, but the amount of time that he's going to serve, that may shock you. And by the way, he's not the only person locked up in connection with the death of 18-year-old Jada Gonzales. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is a Law&Crime legal alert. So recent allegations against the multi-billion-dollar video game industry claim that video games are engineered for addiction. The claims include trying to make sense of the hold that video games seem to have over people where they just can't put the controller down. Every win triggers a hit of dopamine and it creates a cycle of compulsion, disrupts daily life, harms mental health. Well, our legal sponsors are taking on the industry that has allegedly at many times put profit over safety, and they're working to potentially get compensation for all of those impacted. So if you are a loved one have suffered physical or mental health issues due to video games, visit vgclaims.com/sidebar to answer less than 10 questions and check your eligibility to file a claim. Cruz Medina was just 16 years old when he went to a house party thrown by a 17-year-old out in Albuquerque, New Mexico back in 2022. But soon, he and several friends would be kicked out, and one of the other house party attendees would be dead in a hail of gunfire. And now he is starting a prison sentence, a very lengthy prison sentence. Back in December of 2022, 18-year-old Jada Gonzales was a senior at Albuquerque Academy. She recently learned that she'd gotten a full-ride scholarship to college, according to her family. She planned to go to Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. Her mom says Jada wanted to go to medical school. She had this bright future ahead of her. But her dreams were cut short on December 17th, when a bullet flew through the wall of a home where Jada was attending a party. It hit her in the hip. She bled out. She died. Family had to bury her on Christmas Day in 2022. And since then, they have been dealing with cases connected to a wide array, multiple defendants, all accused of having something to do, playing some role in the death of Jada. So over the next 2 years, Albuquerque arrested and charged 5 people, all teenagers, at the time of this shooting. Again, Cruz Medina, 16 years old, Jesse Parra, 19 years old, Isaiah Espinoza, 16 years old, Hezi Escobedo Barrios, 19 years old, and Julian Prieb, 19 years old. So here's what police say happened. So you have these 5 friends who found out apparently about this party on Snapchat, decided to crash it. According to Albuquerque investigators, a 17-year-old was hosting the party and at least one of the parents was home. When the 5 defendants show up and started flashing gang signs and waving guns around, taking photos, they get kicked out. But according to witnesses at the party, some of the kids actually booed as the 5 people left. But they didn't go far, because prosecutors say 16-year-old Isaiah Espinoza hit the side of the home with a spray of bullets from an AR-style rifle before the car he was in sped away. So through photos and videos taken at the party and outside, police were able to identify the suspects. They faced a whole list of charges, everything from tampering with evidence to first-degree murder. Now, before I go any further into the case, I want to bring on special guest John Day, New Mexico criminal defense attorney, friend of the show. John, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time on this. Do you see a lot of these kinds of cases involving young defendants like this, alleged gang affiliations, shootings out in New Mexico?
Sadly, yes, Jesse, this is not the first time there's been one of these cases where, and actually there's a promising young student who's on his or her way to a college, and they've done really well in high school. They're at a party. There's some kind of incident at the party, and someone sprays the house with automatic weapons fire. This is not the first time this has happened. And the context is Albuquerque is a very dangerous city, according to the latest crime statistics. How does somebody that young get a hold of a gun like that? That's a good question, and that's one of the things I think the judge in this case ultimately addressed. But at the start of this, you have a young kid who's got access to, apparently it was an AR-15 type pistol, one of those sort of short barreled, it's not the full length AR-15. Apparently really common for kids to be able to access these on the street. Obviously it's illegal, but New Mexico is a Western state. It's a gun state. There are a lot of guns, there are a lot of hunters, but there are a lot of gun stores. And it's one of those states where, sadly, apparently, young teenagers can access semi-automatic rifles.
John, I'm happy to have you because there's a lot of points in this case I wanted to get your opinion on. So the most recent defendant to learn his fate was Cruz Medina, who I mentioned before. And on Friday, Judge Courtney Weeks handed down her sentence after Medina had agreed to a plea deal with prosecutors last fall. So he pled guilty to murder, conspiracy that resulted in death, and tampering with evidence. 2 charges of shooting into a dwelling and conspiracy to shoot at a dwelling. They were dropped, and Judge Weeks sentenced him to 24 years in prison. So he's going to have to serve at least 85% of his sentence before he's even eligible for any sort of release, if he is. Now, Judge Weeks admonished Medina, saying, "In your own immaturity and anger and complete disregard for the respect of your life and every other individual, you decided to shoot at that house. I know that you knew what happened that night because it was all over the news. You didn't turn yourself in. You continued to terrorize the community and shoot at other homes. And for what? You don't understand the value of other people's lives, and you have shown that." So really strong words there, John, appropriate words. Do you agree with the plea, and do you agree with the sentence here? Do you think that he will be out in less than 24 years?
He's got to do a little over 20 years under this plea deal. The range of time would have been, I think, 17 to 24. And so the judge basically maxed him out under what the plea deal called for. He's got to do 85% of that. That's about a little over 20 years before he can get out. Again, this is this judge deciding that she's had enough of what we're seeing in Albuquerque with these drive-by shootings, perpetrated by young teenagers. And so she maxed him out under New Mexico's law. It's a serious violent offense, obviously. And so he's got to do 85%, a little over 20 before he can get out.
Yeah, so what, his late 30s, maybe early 40s is when he might get out. In your experience, when you see younger people committing crimes and then they're eventually released, do you see a level of recidivism? Why do I say that? Is because according to Albuquerque news station KOB4, Medina apologized in court. He said, "That night I knew what was going to happen and I really didn't want it to happen. I really tried not to do anything. If I could take away what would happen that night, I would." Believe him, maybe don't believe him, not sure. Don't know if he's just saying whatever it is he needs to say, but do you think that this is a danger once he's ultimately released?
You know, New Mexico's prisons, it's not so much rehabilitation as it is, housing for the term of the sentence. There's not a lot of rehab that goes on there. It's probably the same in a lot of other jurisdictions. But I think what the judge, again, was focusing on was not only the level of crime locally here, but also, don't forget about Jada. This young victim was this girl who had gone from one of the local pueblos, a local Native American pueblo, to Albuquerque Academy, which is the most prestigious private high school in Albuquerque. She was on her way to TCU, Texas Christian University in Lubbock. I mean, she had an incredibly bright future. She was a completely innocent victim of this pray and spray type situation where this kid just emptied a clip into the side of a house and probably laughing as he drove away. So the judge was trying to balance, what's a reasonable sentence with the absolute harm to this sweet, totally innocent young Native American girl who had this incredibly bright future. And you don't survive Albuquerque Academy, the local private high school, without being incredibly smart. It's a feeder school to the best schools in the country. This girl had come from the pueblo where life can be kind of tough, and she made it that far. And so I think the judge was reflecting this girl's situation and the loss to the community.
Absolutely, because it's an incredibly tragic loss, and it's something that shouldn't have happened. The same judge actually sentenced the actual triggerman, so Isaiah Espinoza, who was also just 16 when the shooting happened, sentenced him to 29 years in prison. He also pleaded guilty to murder, conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and a video provided to the court showed Espinoza firing the gun out the car window. In his own brief statement, he said, "To the friends, family, and community to which Jada Gonzales belonged to and is still loved, I offer my sincerest apology to you and pray for forgiveness." Espinoza's attorney told the judge that he was just a 16-year-old boy playing with guns and that he was taking responsibility for his actions. Again, he has to also serve 85% of that sentence before he's eligible for parole. A couple of things here. What do you make of those in-court apologies like this and his explanation and the explanation from his attorney?
Well, look, I'm a former prosecutor, a defense lawyer now. It's a case-by-case thing. You have some situations where you actually have remorseful defendants who understand the seriousness of what they've done, the harm that they've caused to the community. And of course, you're always going to have, because it's human nature, you're always going to have people whose statements in courts are maybe a little more contrived, a little more calculated. It just depends on the individuals. There's some genuine remorse out there. And, remember, these kids, they were kids. I mean, they're young teenagers, apparently not a lot of options in their lives, and they turn to the worst possible one. But, a judge, especially an experienced criminal judge like Judge Weeks, they've had a lot of experience listening to in-court statements by defendants, and they're pretty good judges. They're pretty good evaluators of how sincere and genuine these statements are. And I think they always take that into consideration when they're handing down a sentence.
Do you think that they pled guilty because they were looking at life in prison? Is that what they were looking at potentially?
Yeah, they got, they worked to deal with the prosecution. It saved the prosecutors and the victim's family having to go through what would be an incredibly wrenching trial. And my guess is the prosecutors worked with the victim's family and said, look, this is where we are. How do you feel about it? We don't need your approval necessarily, but we want your approval. And if the victim's family said, you know what, that seems reasonable. It seems like we don't have to go through a trial and it's going to put them away for an appropriate amount of time. There was a meeting of the minds by the sides there. And so at the end of the day, you don't have families of a victim going to the media and saying, we don't believe in this deal. We were against it. This is a miscarriage of justice. My guess is the prosecutors got them on board early.
And by the way, after his plea hearing, Espinoza was immediately taken to the Department of Corrections, despite, by the way, still being a few months shy of his 18th birthday. Just gives you an idea of how young these defendants are. And speaking of that, it was Jesse Parra's car that the defendants used in the shooting, according to prosecutors. They say he actually did a U-turn in the road so that Espinoza could shoot at the home. Parra, still faces 6 felony charges, according to New Mexico court records: first-degree murder, conspiracy resulting in death, shooting at a dwelling, conspiracy to shoot at a dwelling, 2 counts of tampering with evidence. He has an evidentiary hearing scheduled for next month, trial coming up in April. Jesse Barrios faces 5 charges: second-degree murder, shooting at a dwelling, conspiracy to shoot at a dwelling, shooting at or from a vehicle resulting in death, conspiracy to commit a shooting from a motor vehicle, and tampering with evidence. The judge just released an order extending deadlines for attorneys in that case, and there's an evidentiary hearing that's planned there for March, trial scheduled in May. John, how come those 2 defendants haven't taken deals yet?
It's unclear, but you can imagine that the prosecutors are happy to get the testimony of these people they've already got convictions on. They've got a flip on their co-defendants. It's just a process of trying to chip away to see, is the defense, is it worth going to trial for these other defendants? Can they work a better deal with the prosecutors? Once a prosecutor locks in co-defendants who are going to have to flip, we're going to have to testify truthfully in court. It's just a matter of chipping away until you get to the very end of the chain. And so I'm not surprised that they haven't pled yet. They're still working out the details. But if you're prosecuting this case in the DA's office, you've got to be happy that you've at least got these 2 deals signed and ready to go, and you're just working away at the other defendants.
With the trigger man, nonetheless. So let me ask you a question. You think as part of those deals, in the actual paperwork, in the actual agreement, they have to testify against Parra and Barrios?
Yeah, they're not going to, the prosecutors are not going to agree to something like that unless they know that they're going to have so-called truthful statements by these defendants. And if they don't come through, again, if they don't testify truthfully in the eyes of the prosecution, the deal can be off and they can be facing the max. You go back and you start over. But so there's a benefit to defendants who have pled. The prosecutors get the benefit of their testimony against the people, the trigger people, in this case, the trigger person in their eyes. And so it's a methodical way of building your case.
By the way, it seems like they are going to have, if they don't take deals, that they're going to have separate trials. Is it unique? Is it typical that we see separate trials for different defendants who are allegedly involved in the same event?
Well, that's where the finger pointing comes in. If there are separate trials, you're going to have, you don't have the other defendant in the courtroom, and that whoever is basically facing that charge gets to say, well, it was the other guy who's not here, and you can blame him or her. And so it's not unusual. Defense lawyers are obviously going to want those trials severed. They don't want to be going to trials with the 2 of them sitting next to each other. But it also benefits the prosecution because, if they need to flip one more person to get to the person who pulled the trigger in their eyes, they can do it this way. And again, it's a methodical way to build your case. The prosecution's got to feel pretty good about how this has gone so far. The family, the victim, also probably has to feel we're getting the best justice we can under the circumstances.
Yeah. And by the way, according to court records, the charges against that other defendant, Julian Priebe, they were dropped in November. Look, just an incredibly sad case. Your heart and prayers go out to Jada's family. You think about just an innocent loss of life, what she could have achieved in life. Her dreams were shattered, and it was a senseless act of violence. But how many times do we cover that here on Sidebar? John Day, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.